Hello, today I'm going to show you how to write an Azure function and how to get it talking with a Couchbase Server cluster. If you haven't heard of Couchbase before today, don't worry, I'll give you some links at the end of the video to learn more about it. For now, all you need to know is that Couchbase is a NoSQL database that's fast, flexible, and can scale very well. Data is stored in Couchbase as JSON, and each of these JSON documents has a key to identify it. There's a lot more that Couchbase can do, but that's all you need to know for now. We're going to talk about Azure Functions today, so you don't need to actually have any Azure credit or use any Azure credit or spend any money to follow along, because I'll be running both Couchbase Server and Azure Functions on my local machine. This means you can develop locally without spending any money and deploy globally into any Azure data center. So first, let's get Couchbase set up. I've already installed Couchbase Server Enterprise 5.5, though any version of Couchbase 5.0 or newer should work fine for this demo. You can download Couchbase and install it on your machine by going to couchbase.com/downloads, or you can install from the Azure Marketplace, or you can install it with AKS using the Couchbase Kubernetes operator, or you can even use custom VMs. It's really up to you. I'm going to create a new bucket here that I want my Azure Functions to talk to. So a bucket is just a collection of JSON documents, and I'll call it Azure Functions, and I'll make it the minimum size here in memory quota. Don't worry too much about the details here for now. So I'll create that bucket. I also need to create a user that has access to this bucket, so I'll be able to supply some credentials. So I'll just create a user called Matt and give it a password of password. And the role I want to give this is just on the Azure Functions bucket and just application access. Now, if you're using the Community Edition, you're going to have to pick a higher level. You don't have this fine grain of control here. So we'll go ahead and add that user. So now Couchbase is all ready to be used by Azure Functions as a database. The next step I'm going to do is create a couple of Azure functions. One of these functions will be able to create documents in Couchbase. The other will be able to retrieve them from Couchbase. So I've already opened Visual Studio. Say File, New, Project. And we're going to Visual C#, and then we'll click Cloud, and then Azure Functions, and I'll just paste in this folder that I'm going to use. And I'm going to call this Azure Functions Video. I'll post all of this to GitHub if you want to see the source code. You can go to that later. Hit OK. The next step is to select what kind of functions to create. I'm going to use the V2 preview, which uses .NET Standard, and HTTP trigger. Again, don't worry too much about the details for now, but I'm just going to create Azure functions that can be called via an HTTP request. There are other types of functions you can explore later. For access rights, I'm going to choose anonymous, meaning that no authentication or authorization is required to use these functions. So I hit OK here. This is going to create a basic shell of a Hello World Azure Functions project for you. And once it finishes creating this project, there's going to be one function in there called Function1. So we can go ahead and just run that right now. I'm going to hit Control F5 in Visual Studio. And it's going to open up a console project here with the Azure Functions Lightning Bolt. And it's going to show me, since it's an HTTP function, it's going to show me the URL to execute that function. So I'll go ahead and do that by going over here to a tool called Postman. And you can see this is the URL that the Azure Functions told me. I'll go ahead and do a GET request against that. And it's going to return a message that's saying, hey, please pass in a name. So I'll pass in my name of Matt. Execute it again. It says, hello, Matt. So it's really just a very simple hello world function just to return the name that I entered. It's not talking to Couchbase yet. It's just manipulating strings. So at this point, let's take a step back and talk about what Azure Functions are. So Azure Functions are Microsoft's answer to Amazon's Lambdas or Google's Cloud Functions. This is also known as serverless architecture. And I'll give you a way to write a small piece of code and let Azure handle all the underlying servers, deployments, scaling, and execution that's involved in running that code. And Azure is only going to bill you for the time that those functions are executed. So it's a really simple way to abstract away all the details of the cloud and just deploy a piece of code. All right, so let's go ahead and write the get and set functions that are going to interact with Couchbase and make this Azure function a little more interesting than just a hello world. So let's start by adding the Couchbase.NET SDK to the project. I'll do that with NuGet here, with the NuGet UI. I'll look for Couchbase Net Client. There it is, and I'll install that. This is available for .NET and .NET Core. All right, so I've added that NuGet package to the project. So next I'm going to comment out this function here that Visual Studio created for us. We don't really need that one. Now when working with Couchbase and C#, it's a good idea to model your document as a C# class. So I'm going to create a very simple model called my document. This is just going to have a couple, 3 properties. So a string for a name, a number, integer for a shoe size, and we'll have a decimal for a account balance. Now documents are stored as JSON in Couchbase, so they can be much more complex. They can contain arrays and nested objects, etc. We're just going to keep it simple for now. All right, so next let's create a function that's going to be responsible for creating documents. So we'll start by giving it a function name, and I'll just call it setDoc. We're going to set a new document. And this will be a static method. It's going to return iActionResult. And we can call this one setDoc. Well, it really doesn't matter what we call it there. An HTTP trigger is what this is. That's the type of function that we're doing. And I'm going to again say anonymous on this. And we'll say this is a post. So we're expecting a post request to this endpoint. And we don't need to specify route for now. And then I'm going to expect information that's posted to this function that's going to be following the same sort of model I set out here in C#. So that's what I'm expecting to be coming into this as input. I'm going to be putting that into a C# instance of my document called doc. All right. And what I've decided to do is not allow the ID of the document, the key of the document, to be specified by whoever's posting this data. So I'm going to generate that internally. Your mileage may vary. You can use what you want for an ID. I'm just going to create a GUID for that. The next thing to do is to actually use a Couchbase bucket object to insert, and that needs an ID, the key, and also needs the document itself. Now this bucket is red here because I've not actually created that bucket object yet. I'm going to get to that in a second. And then finally, at the end of the method, we're going to return an OK object result with a message saying, hey, a new document was inserted with ID, and we'll give it the ID there that we created. All right. So all this function is supposed to be doing is generating an ID, inserting a document with that ID, and then returning the message to whoever called this endpoint. Now, this bucket here, this is how we're going to interact with Couchbase, is via the bucket. Now, where should this bucket come from? Now, notice that this function is static, and the class that it's in is also static. And all this code is isolated away from the underlying server by Azure, which means that we have to consider that this function may be running for the very first time. Every time we write this code, it may be the very first time that the user is coming through this, or the code is being executed. So what I could do is I could create some Couchbase objects here. We'll define a cluster first, connect to this, kind of like a connection to the actual cluster. So we're bringing in some of the namespaces for Couchbase up here. Just kind of clean that up a little bit. So we brought in Couchbase, and we'll bring a client configuration. Yep. And that's going to contain servers. So a list of servers here. I only have one for my local example, which is fine. A URI to that server is going to be localhost 8091. Okay. Let's go up a little bit. And we'll need to authenticate to that cluster by using those credentials I created earlier, Matt and password. And then we'll need to get a bucket by using cluster and saying open bucket. And the name of the bucket was Azure Functions, right? Yes. Okay. So now we have the bucket, and we'll also need to, at the end of this, dispose the cluster. So we did all this to connect to the Couchbase cluster. Then we interacted with the bucket on the cluster, and then we disposed of the cluster. So if I did this, a new cluster object would be created and disposed every single time that this function was called. Now this would work, but it's not the way you should do it. So a cluster object, this part right here, is expensive to create. Let's say it takes a lot of time, and this would mean that your Azure function is going to take a huge performance hit every time you call it. So instead, in a normal ASP.NET application, we'd want to create this cluster one time and reuse it throughout the life cycle of that application. Now, we don't have complete control like we do in an ASP.NET application of when this runs or how often it runs, that sort of thing. We do have some control. So I'm going to show you how that works. So let's store this bucket as a static member of the class. And what this means is that as long as Azure Functions keeps reusing this function object here, it's called function 1, we call it whatever we want to, but as long as we do that, it's not going to create the cluster every time. So ideally, I want the cluster object to be created if necessary, and only if necessary, and in a thread-safe way, so it's not, if it's being called multiple times in quick succession, that is, each one of those threads is not going to create a new cluster that eventually gets thrown away. So we want to create this in a thread-safe way, as optimal as possible. To do this, we can use .NET's lazy class. So I'm going to create a private, static, read-only member, and I'm going to use lazy here. I'm going to lazy of iBucket. So iBucket is the actual interface that Couchbase uses, and we're going to use new here. We're going to say new lazy, again of iBucket. And when you create a lazy object, when you instantiate that, you give it a lambda, an anonymous function, and you define that function in here. And what this means is that when the bucket object, when this bucket is actually accessed for the first time, that the code in this lambda is going to run, and it's going to return a result, and that result will be stored in this lazy object for subsequent accesses. So it will only be run once, assuming it's not been run before. So let's just do some hard coding here. So we need to tell it the URI, the bucket name, Azure Functions, the username was Matt, the password was the very secure, definitely don't use that in production, password. And we can move up this cluster stuff here out of this function up inside of this lazy here. And instead of setting var bucket, we're going to say return. And we can just use these strings here to paste them in right there. Bucket name goes in here. You're getting the idea here. And password. Okay. So this means that this code will all be run the very first time, and only the very first time, that this bucket is accessed. And then whatever is returned by this will be stored in this static property of the class, of this function 1 class, and can then be used subsequent calls to this Azure function. So down here, we can get rid of this cluster dispose, and we can say bucket.value, that's part of the lazy object there. That's how we tell it we're going to access the actual underlying value of the lazy, and do the insert. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run that again, run this Azure function. And you can see that we've got one endpoint here, one HTTP function called setDoc. Let's open up Postman again. And let's see if I have one stored somewhere here. We have a post. Yes. So I'm going to do a post now to this endpoint, setDoc. In the body of the post, I'm going to post this JSON data here, name, shoe size, balance. Go ahead and send that. And so it's going to return this message that, hey, a new document was inserted, and I created this ID for it. And if you look over here in Azure Functions, you can see that, oh yes, setDoc was executed. And then if I go back to the Couchbase console and go to the Azure Functions bucket, you see there's one item in there, and it's going to be the one I inserted. Matt, 13.17 cents. All right, so let's go back to that lazy object a little bit here. I hard-coded a bunch of values in here, and I think it's probably better to have those in a config file. So to set up config locally, all I do is go to this local.settings.json, which Visual Studio created for me. It's just a JSON file. And instead, inside of this values, I'm going to paste those Couchbase settings, the URI, the bucket name, the username, password. Those are all going to be there in local settings.json. So then instead of hard coding it, I can pull from the config instead. So instead of strings, I can say environment.get variable, get environment variable, and the name of that variable. So it's going to pull those settings from local settings.json. Just an example of Couchbase URI here and Couchbase URI here. So this is going to be the HTTP localhost 8091. Okay, we'll go ahead and then run this again just to demonstrate that the configuration is being used. So back to Postman. Let's change this up a little bit. Let's change this to a HOD, and let's say he has a shoe size of 12, and he has a little more money in his account than me, $1.17. Go ahead and hit send to make that post. It created a second document for me in Couchbase, and just retrieve docs. You can see there it is. There's HOD's document right there with a different key. Now, let's go ahead and create a function to retrieve the documents from the bucket. So we've got a function here that will create a document. Let's create one that'll actually return a document. So do another function name here. We'll call this one getDoc. And again, it's going to be public static iActionResult. We'll call it getDoc. And the same sort of stuff's going to be in our HTTP trigger, authorization level anonymous. And in this case, we're going to be right here. It's going to be a get. It's only going to accept a get. And again, we can say route is null. And instead of specifying an object here, we can also specify the more generic HTTP request. And that's going to come from ASP.NET. So you can see kind of some of the details are leaking through here that we know that Azure is running ASP.NET behind the scenes, but that may change at some point. Anyway, so that's the more generic version. So that gives us all the information about the HTTP document. So all I really want from that is the ID. We're going to expect a query string value of ID to be passed to this HTTP function, the ID of the document. And then we're going to retrieve the document from Couchbase by saying bucket.value and get. And it's going to be, we're going to try to put into a my document instance. But it's returning JSON, right? And this is just saying take that JSON and serialize it into an instance of my document. And then finally return a OK object result. That document, we could return the whole document, but that contains things like potentially error messages and things like that. So we just want to return the document value itself. We'll go ahead and run this console app again, the Azure Functions simulator, I guess you could call it. And we'll go up to Postman. And this time we'll do a get. Just switch back up here for a second. You'll see that we've got two HTTP functions, one for get and one for set. So I'm going to do the getDoc one. And again, I have any sort of validation. So we just need to say ID equals, and then we'll take the ID of the last one we inserted, which I think was for HOD. Go ahead and do the get. And there it is. We can see that this endpoint is returning the document based on the ID we're passing in. So now we have an Azure function to create a document, an Azure function to get a document. We can do a lot more with Couchbase, like update documents, delete documents, do partial updates and deletes of sub-documents. We can execute SQL queries. We can execute full text search queries. We can do analytics. We can do a lot more, but this is enough to get you started with Azure Functions. The basics here of how to manage your cluster and your bucket and lazy, and how to get that bucket object, which is the key to interact with Couchbase. I promised you some more links to learn more about this, so the first thing I want you to do is go and join the Couchbase community directory. This is the place to find other Couchbase experts, champions, and community members like yourself to talk to them about Couchbase. I'll see you there. If you want to learn more about Azure Functions, you can go to the Microsoft Docs site there. I'll get you started with Azure Functions, some of the other options out there in terms of webhooks and timers and things like that. To get started with Couchbase, there's a link here to the documentation to do a quick install of Couchbase Server. And then if you want to write some more code against the Couchbase.NET SDK, I've got a link there to help get you started using the SDK. Thank you very much for watching.